But the Cold War is over, and we now live in a different world, and arguably perhaps a second nuclear age. One dominated by issues both of resurgence of competition between nuclear powers and a wider proliferation of these weapons. This concept of proliferation, therefore, is key. We have to understand that there are really two forms of proliferation: vertical and horizontal. Vertical proliferation corresponds to the amassing of atomic weapons by established nuclear powers. So this is what we've mostly been talking about since now, the ways in which the Soviet Union and the United States continuously increased their stocks in an exercise of vertical proliferation. Horizontal proliferation corresponds to the spread of nuclear weapons to conventionally armed nations. So the acquisition of nuclear weapons by states that were formerly not in possession of them. Now, vertical proliferation has been managed essentially by a bilateral process between the Soviet Union and the United States through a series of treaties: the SALT Treaty, the START Treaty, the SALT Treaty, the New START Treaty, whereby the United States and Soviet Union agreed to reduce their weapon stocks. Effectively, it was an exercise in rationalizing deterrence. Since the basic premises of deterrence were never questioned, the principles were maintained, but simply there was an agreement that the same assurance could be achieved without as many weapons. If both sides could agree to reduce their stocks and to remain within certain limits, and to put in place various monitoring mechanisms to make sure that no one was breaking their commitments, then deterrence could be maintained at a lower expense. And this was achieved in the periods of relative warming of the Cold War and beyond the Cold War. This has now come into question again in recent years. There were considerable tensions under the Trump administration with a project to expand and modernize American nuclear deterrence, and also a reluctance to renew existing treaties. This is still to be resolved. We'll see how the new administration deals with this in the coming year, or in fact in the coming months. But we are certainly entering a period where the geopolitical tensions between Russia and the United States and the rise of China is putting the nuclear rivalry back at the forefront of the agenda, nuclear rivalry between major powers. Prior to these more recent developments, most of the concerns with proliferation have been regarding horizontal proliferation, the expansion of the nuclear club, if you want. Now, this was originally addressed by the 1970 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT. And today, of course, there are concerns about the effectiveness of the NPT, with a number of states having acquired nuclear weapons in recent years, and a number of other states apparently poised to. But in fact, the concerns about the effectiveness of this treaty go back to its inception. And when we should be mindful that actually horizontal proliferation has been generally slower than most commentators, analysts, and politicians expected. In the early 1960s, President Kennedy predicted that there would be 15 to 20 nuclear states by 1975. And we have probably 9 today. So relatively speaking, proliferation has actually been quite low. If we look at those nuclear states today, well, we are obviously talking about the United States and Russia, overwhelmingly in possession of the largest capabilities. In addition to these numbers, we have very large stocks, and we have lower levels of deployed capabilities. We then find in the order of the acquisition of nuclear weapons, the United Kingdom, who went nuclear in 1952, possesses about 200 weapons today. France, whose first bomb was detonated in 1960 with about 300 weapons. China, who has retained still a fairly small nuclear capability since its first bomb in 1964, but certainly has the capability and maybe the willingness to increase that capability in a relatively short frame. That remains to be seen. We've seen certainly that the US now wants to, one of the obstacles to arms control treaties with Russia is that the United States wants China to be involved in them now, something that the Chinese are refusing to do. Then we have the non-signatory of the NPT, Israel. So these five first states, United States, Russia, United Kingdom, France, and China, these states all possess nuclear weapons in, let's say, in accordance with international law, because they have obtained these weapons before the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They are recognized as legitimate owners of these weapons in a sense, although the NPT, to which they are signatories, demands of them that they work towards the elimination of their weapons, something they have demonstrably not done. Since the NPT, there are really four additional nuclear powers. Israel is a non-signatory of the NPT and an undeclared nuclear power, but is thought to possess around 80 weapons today. India acquired its own bomb in 1974 and has also never signed the NPT. Same with its regional rival Pakistan, who followed suit with 1998, and of course North Korea, who has withdrawn from the NPT and since is thought to have built about 20 nuclear weapons since 2006. Some fear that although nuclear proliferation has been quite slow, that we might well be on the brink of a second age of proliferation. Certainly we live in a different world than we did in the Cold War. There's no longer a bipolarity in world politics, even though the US and Russia remain the main nuclear powers. What we see, however, is the efforts by so-called rogue states to acquire nuclear weapons. The case is the case of North Korea, of course, and of course Iran is widely thought to be moving towards nuclear weapons, and we've seen that this has been a source of considerable tension for several decades, really. Part of the issue with states acquiring nuclear weapons, even if they're isolated states such as North Korea or Iran, is the concern that the acquisition of nuclear weapons by one of these states could have regional domino effects, which is to mean that they might lead other neighboring states to acquire nuclear weapons. This is particularly a concern in the Middle East, where the fear is that if Iran was to go nuclear, then there would be a strong incentive for Saudi Arabia, Egypt perhaps, to acquire nuclear weapons, so that only a few new additional members might in turn bring a much wider proliferation. Now, of course, the question is, well, what are the implications for international security of nuclear weapons? And one response to this is that proposed by the international relations theorist Kenneth Waltz, who, in a quite famous statement and series of writings, has argued that the spread of nuclear weapons, their proliferations, is in fact a vector of peace. Because, he claims, nuclear weapons eliminates uncertainty about the outcome of war. It makes it certain that if you go to war between nuclear powers, then there will be, if not mutual annihilation, at least destruction on a scale that makes the kinds of strategic calculation behind war simply unacceptable. Effectively, Waltz is extending the logic or the claims of mutually assured destruction, of mutual deterrence during the Cold War between the Soviet Union and Russia, and arguing, well, if it prevented war between the Soviet Union and the United States, then it will have the same kinds of effects elsewhere in the world. And if you wanted perhaps a supporting case for that view, you might point to the situation between Pakistan and India, rival states who have been to war since their respective independence and who have entered periods of considerable tension, but who, it could be claimed, have moderated their saber rattling, have ultimately stepped back from major conflict because they possess nuclear weapons, because the consequences of a full-blown war between them would be catastrophic. Now, nonetheless, there are a series of problems with this Waltzian optimism. The first of these problems is that deterrence becomes increasingly complex when you step outside of two-player games. In a world in which increasing numbers of states would have nuclear weapons, deterrence is likely to increasingly resemble a Mexican standoff, where the consequences of two rival powers going through deterrence moves is no longer sufficient to encapsulate the complexity of the politics or the deterrent games, because other states are involved and possibly profiting from the failure of deterrence between two sides. In other words, the whole construct of deterrence that rests on game theory, rational calculation, just falls apart. It can no longer make predictive claims once you are outside of two-player situations. That's not to say deterrence wouldn't necessarily work, but that we can have no assurance, even in its own terms, that deterrence would succeed or would not incur a failure. Secondly is the problem of accidents. And these are multiple. I mean, you can read quite staggering litanies of accidents. Eric Schlosser's Command and Control is such an edifying read. But I'll just address a couple of them, or three of them rather. In 1961, a B-52 bomber carrying 2 hydrogen bombs during a routine mission broke apart in midair over North Carolina. One of the weapons went through all of its arming steps to detonate, and when it hit the ground, a firing signal was sent. Only the failure of a single switch prevented the detonation of a bomb 250 times the power of the Hiroshima bomb. And if it had, a corner of North Carolina would be quite a different place today. In 1979, National Security Advisor Brzezinski was woken at 3 a.m. to be informed that 2,200 Soviet missiles were heading towards the United States. He was minutes away from notifying the president before the alert was found to have been caused by an early warning training tape. So there was a whole array of accidents, or rather false reports of nuclear attack that were provoked by a variety of phenomena. Some of it was inadvertently inserted training tapes. It's estimated that between 1977 and 1984, not estimated, these are reports from the US military. Between 1977 and 1984, 1,152 moderately serious false alarms were recorded within the US early warning system, which is an average of almost 3 false alarms per week. Staggering numbers. And to make you feel even more secure, the Pentagon simply no longer provides any such statistic publicly, so we have no idea how many false alarms still occur today. As I've said, the reasons for these false alarms are multiple. They involve failed computer chips, flights of geese, the moon, any number of sources. Finally, in 1983, NATO was conducting large-scale exercises in Western Europe under the name of Operation Able Archer. These exercises were designed to simulate preparation for nuclear war. But what they achieved was to convince paranoid Soviet leadership that these were a prelude to a genuine first strike. And so the Soviet Union, largely unbeknownst to the United States and to its NATO allies, readied their own nuclear forces for an all-out attack. It is fortunate that a no false alarm was reported by a Soviet early warning system in that circumstance, or it could have obviously precipitated war. All of this could be summed up by Scott Sagan's point, that nuclear weapons may have made deliberate war less likely, but the complex and tightly coupled nuclear arsenal we have constructed has simultaneously made accidental war more likely. Again, remember that deterrence relies on the fact that you must be ready to wage nuclear war. And under the very short time frames available to decision makers to respond to a report of an attack, this means that all these weapons, or a large amount of them, have to be on hair trigger alerts. And so the possibility that they could be launched accidentally is quite considerable. And of course, returning to the question of proliferation, the more nuclear states we have, the greater the risk of accident. Particularly, but certainly not only, within more recent, newer nuclear states, which will have less experience with the use of these weapons and with the problems involved in safeguarding the use of these weapons. A third problem with being as optimistic as Walt is the potential problem of rogue states. Now, I think this is an interesting question to consider because implicitly the accusations are made that certain states cannot be trusted with nuclear weapons. This is very much what we hear regarding North Korea and Iran. And what is generally implied, or sometimes stated explicitly, is that these states are irrational. That their leaders are crazy, fanatical, and therefore cannot be properly deterred. That the rules of deterrence don't apply to them in the same way because they don't think like classical, rational states. Now, there's perhaps grounds to be a little bit skeptical of that view. Are these states fundamentally different from other states? Is North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons irrational? Is it not possible to understand its possession of them in very rational terms? But conversely, and this is not necessarily comforting, we might want to question the rationality of conventional nuclear powers too. And we've seen, of course, through the account of the Cold War I provided you, that it may well be, in some cases, merely luck that has prevented nuclear war. But in any case, it's important to note that part of the debate about nuclear proliferation also has to do with the types of actors that possess them. And these might be rogue states, but they might also be non-state actors. And this, of course, feeds into the fear of nuclear terrorism. And nuclear terrorism, of course, is thought to raise significant problems for any strategy of deterrence. First of all, the claim that's made about rogue states is perhaps made with greater persuasiveness with regard to non-state actors, in the sense that they may ascribe to belief systems or possess views of the world that mean that they are not easily deterred. They may be quite happy to die. They may believe that nuclear war might be ushering in a desirable apocalypse. So there's difficulties in terms of counting on the instinct of self-preservation of these actors. But there is, even in the case where we might assume self-preservation, one of the difficulties with non-state actors is that they may not necessarily have an obvious return address. If, let's say, ISIS acquired a nuclear weapon and detonated it, or threatened to detonate it, where would the retaliation to it be directed? These are not territorial entities, at least not now, and so therefore it's not obvious that you can apply a strategy of deterrence to them. Now, of course, we have to be very mindful of what happens when the strategy of deterrence is questioned in this way, because this was effectively one of the rationales advanced in the aftermath of 9/11 for a new policy of preemption. The US government argued, notably in its case for the Iraq War, that a terrorist threat, or particularly one that would be in possession of weapons of mass destruction, and above all nuclear weapons, is one that has to be addressed through preemption, through action that anticipates such an event, since deterrence cannot be counted upon. So when deterrence is deemed to fail, and that we posit actors with the motivation to use nuclear weapons, we will likely lead to or invite new kinds of policies, and ones which of course may be problematic in their own regard. Certainly in the case of Iraq, many would think so. All of this perhaps leads us to a final question about our nuclear age, and it is to know whether we could still dream of the ambition of a movement such as Global Zero. That is to say, the drive for nuclear disarmament, a world which would divest itself of nuclear weapons, which would remove the sword of Damocles that hangs over all our heads, the perpetual threat of annihilation. It is a beautiful dream. It is one even that has been publicly supported by the former US President Barack Obama. The question for us, and for one of the things we can consider in our live session, is whether such a goal is achievable and how it might be achieved.